He's about a year old. He's not yet quite a year old. And so that's a good kind of judge. I got him, I think, maybe 2-ish, maybe a little over 2 months after he was born. And he was already really, at that point, he was, it might have been 3 months after he was born. But at that point, he was, really skinny, really, for a ball python, they're not like, one of those snakes that are just a little stick snake. A lot of snakes, like corn snakes and garter snakes and those kind of snakes, their body shape is different. Their skeletal structure is different. It looks like a big fat monster, but it's actually, there are ribs that are skeletal structure wise that are bigger and then narrow it down. And so for a ball python, this is actually a normal, ratio between the width of their neck versus the width of their body. Now, when I got him, he wasn't like emaciated or anything. When I got him, he was, granted, he was, just barely below average in terms of weight. And ball pythons are kind of weird in terms of their backbone, their skeletal structure in their backbone. When they are positioned certain ways, they've got a pretty high ridge just in their backbone itself. And so, to a certain extent, that little ridge there is normal, but when it starts protruding, when that backbone starts protruding and sticking out, a lot more obviously, that's a sign that they're a little underweight. And honestly, that'll probably come before the actual width of the snake. When the width is starting to get real narrow, that's even more of a sign, obviously. But these big mass production places, unfortunately, that sell these animals, they're usually in it for the money, sadly, not for the health of the animal. And so what they'll do is they'll basically feed them as little as humanly possible, so that it takes money to feed these animals, and it will heavily diminish, especially if you've got thousands and thousands of snakes like the company where he came from. It will heavily diminish your overall cost if you only feed them just enough to sustain them, but not enough to actually allow them to grow, really. Number one, save money on food costs. Number two, save money on, when they finally do sell, the weight of the animal being shipped in the mail. When it's a bigger, heavier snake like this, it costs more not only to feed, but to ship because of the obvious added weight on it, the more it would grow. And so what they try to do is they try to feed them enough that they're not technically in danger of dying because they've got enough to sustain themselves, but they're feeding them to where they're on the skinny side. No, they're not emaciated, but they're definitely underweight. And it's the bare minimum, really, for them to survive and not be, I guess, greatly impacted by it. Maybe they're just minimally so. But the problem is that some animals will not just grow slower because they're eating less. some animals, and this has not been studied very much, but I know from my own experience with my own, right here, Ember, he did not do what he was, quote, supposed to do in terms of they fed him less, but he just kept growing. And so he was skinny, but he was growing at the same rate, or almost the same rate, maybe a little slower, but he was growing far faster than the amount that they were feeding him. And so he continued to grow, but they weren't giving him, the amount of food for that kind of growing. So basically, as a result, you started to kind of see a prominent backbone on this animal in literally just the few short 2 months that they had him from hatch date. And they're not born, these animals aren't born right out of the egg to be able to eat right away. They actually usually don't eat for a good month or so, because they have to go through a process after being born. They kind of have to go through a process of shedding, and just kind of, a newborn animal is weird, but from what I've heard, they're actually, they don't eat right away. They do have some yolk, or whatever the term is for reptilian eggs. I would imagine it's still yolk that they absorb from the egg, but that's about it. And this animal is not overweight. This animal actually could gain a little more weight and still not be fat. It's actually feeding day, so this is the thin side of Ember. This is Ember with, I did this on purpose. I did this to make sure, you saw Ember on the day that he is the thinnest, the day that he really doesn't have much in his stomach. Feeding day, they don't have a big lump of something in their stomach because they've digested all of that. So they may have some feces in their intestines, but they don't have this big lump of something, right? So this is just him naturally. And that's, like I said, for a ball python, because of their skeletal structure, that's quite normal. It disturbs me that even when the animal is growing, at a rate that outpasses the amount of food that you're giving it, that just in a very short period of time, it's going to lose that much body mass, because you still refuse to feed it, the amount that you should be feeding it. My guess is when he came to me, true story, when he came to me, the first time I fed him, he was ravenous. Snakes usually will only eat as much as they feel comfortable eating, as much as they've got just like we do. They say, okay, I'm full now, I don't want any more. They're not like, for example, dogs, that even when they're full will continue to eat. Most snakes, when they're full, they'll just stop. So when I first got him, he was just disturbingly ravenous. He just kept looking for more and more and more, and I gave him enough that it wasn't too much, but I did give him more than you normally would. Normally you'd give him one or two. He was so skinny, and he, again, wasn't emaciated, but he was skinny, obviously underweight. So I actually gave him 3, and then a few days later, gave him 2 more, and then just, was feeding him, almost twice the amount, for the first week. But after the first week, I went back to normal feeding, just because he was so ravenous and kept looking for more. After that first week, he had, probably 4 or 5 in his belly, and the next week when I tried to feed him, I offered him 3, and he only took 1. So then I just did that kind of pattern for a few months, and he typically takes 2, but no more than 2. That one day, I fed him 3, and he was still looking for a 4th one. He would have probably taken 6 if you gave it to him. That tells me that he hadn't been fed in a very long time, like probably a month or more that he had not been fed. Now he is actually quite picky. Not only will he only eat 1 or 2, but he will only eat rats. And of course they're juvenile rats, they're like pup rats or something, but they're not they're not full grown rats at this point, but he will only eat rats. I gave him a rat to try and boost his nutrition a little bit because of his weight issue, and he just, after tasting that 1 rat, he said, okay, I want rats now. They were feeding him mice only, and they were feeding him, for the size that he was when I got him, they were feeding him 1 size below the size that they should have been feeding him. You're supposed to feed them about the same width of their body, at least 1, and it was 1 size below. And if you look at all the different sizes, there's quite a bit of a gap. There's a big jump between one size and the next size. So of course you don't want to feed them something that's too big for them. But he was ready for the next size. And even with that big jump in sizes, it's like, he could take the next size up, and they're feeding him this little tiny thing. So when they do feed him, they're feeding him about 1/3 or half the amount that is, acceptable. I'd say half on the low end, 1/3 or 1/4 on the higher end, of what you could feed this animal and them not be overweight. And on the opposite side of things, if they know that they're going to keep the animal, and they know they're not going to sell it, they do the polar opposite. An animal that they're keeping for breeding, what they do, and this is just as bad, what they do is they basically power feed the animal. They will feed them literally until they have a bowel movement, which means that the animal is so full that it's pooping. And for a snake, that's not normal, because snakes are reptiles. They have very slow digestive systems. They're kind of like sloths in their digestive systems. They only poop like once a week. So if you're feeding them until they poop, that's, risking rupturing their stomachs and their intestines. And they do that so that they can get them to breeding size as quickly as possible. They want them to be the size of breeding very just wrong in every way. just wrong in every way.